Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. I'm Scott Irwin, and my colleague Todd Hubbs is my co-pilot for this webinar. Updated supply, demand, and price prospects for corn and soybeans based on the very interesting information in today's crop production and WASDE reports, particularly the WASDE use numbers. Want to point out something before we get started with the material is that we have a brand new webinar section at the FarmDoc and the FarmDoc Daily and Farm Policy News sections. They're all the same. That contains an archive where you will find easy access to today's slides and eventually the video that goes with the complete presentation and the Q&A. And that reminds me, please submit your questions during the presentation. And if you're dialed in, of course, on your dashboard, you can download the handouts right now from within your GoToWebinar control panel. So that's just the administrative matters. And Todd, I'm going to turn it over to you to take on the corn market, which is a little interesting today.
Yeah, a bit of a surprise, I think, for some people that the yield went up a bit, but we'll talk about it in detail. We're going to start out sort of rehashing the September 1st stocks reports and that real shocker we saw, 300 million plus bushel surprise in the September 1st stocks reports, which brought stocks down to 2.1 billion bushels, and I think Scott indicated they probably overestimated last year's crop a bit. There's some error in there and maybe some loss from flooding damage, but it was a big surprise, and I think USDA is probably not happy to miss that much, even though that's the estimate. And this gives you an idea of just how big a surprise it was when you think of percent terms of that stocks report. It's the largest positive surprise we've seen since the 80s.
Right.
I mean, it was a big one. It felt like it was due in a lot of ways.
Well, look at all those negative bars since 2014, Todd.
It's got to happen at some point, right? And so I was pleasantly surprised, even though I wish it had happened in June. But it is what it is. But it was a big surprise. And as such, whoops, I hit the wrong way. We saw a huge fourth quarter feed and residual. We needed 681 million bushels to hit USDA's projection. By my calculations, it's over 1 billion bushel feed and residual in fourth quarter. And that carried in to the 18-19 ending stocks number and 19-20 feed and residual estimates as well, which I'll get to later in the presentation. So let's turn to what everybody's talking about. This is corn planted acreage, and we saw planted acreage in this report come down slightly and harvested acres come down slightly. This is what the USDA originally said. There were 90 million acres, and now we're down. And, when you go state by state and look at where it's come down, Illinois is down 200,000 from the 10.7 million acre estimate. It's at 10.5. Iowa's down 100,000. Minnesota's down 100,000. And South Dakota's down 100,000. And Nebraska was up 100,000, so Nebraska's at 10.1. So when you think about where the acreage moves went and why we saw it come down a little bit.
Just to note, this chart has changed from the previous year.
Yeah, this is the original 2019 planted acres. And what we saw in this latest report is they lowered acres in some of the major Corn Belt states, except for Nebraska. And as such, we've got 89.94 million acres of corn planted with about 81.8 million acres harvested. So that harvested acres number came down as well. Could we see it creep up or creep down as we move through the rest of the season? I think we could. I don't know what you think, Scott, but with the kind of weather we're seeing out in the high plains today, and you could see that harvested acres number come down now.
That wouldn't surprise me at all with the major weather event going on in the western Corn Belt today and the next few days. Plus, just there is some confusion on how things were reported through Prevent Plant, FSA acres, and so on. So it wouldn't surprise me if we saw a little more drift down.
No, me neither. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be 3 or 4 million acres or anything like that. And if it is, that's really going to be something. But yeah, I think you could see it drift down some more before it's all said and done. Yield numbers, USDA bumped it 0.2 bushels an acre to 168.4. The trade thought it would be around 167.5. Yeah, I don't know what I'll talk about this in a little more detail. I don't agree with the 168.4. I don't know about you, Scott, if you think it's lower. I think it is. My models say it is, but is it feasible that number's correct? Yes, it is. It is feasible. And the kind of price reaction we saw today in the corn market after the release of this report seemed a bit extreme to me, but we can talk about that more a little bit later. We look at trend deviations from corn yield over time. We're down about 4 from the trend I'm using in the model I use to forecast yields, down about 4.8 bushels. From what we would expect, this is the first time since 2013 we've even been below trend at all. We've had a series of really good corn crops. And that really, I think, goes back to what do we think about state by state? And what do we think about these state yields? Illinois they're projecting Illinois at 179 bushels an acre, down 1 from the previous report, down substantially from last year's 211. Is there more room to run down in Illinois? I think there might be. I don't know what you think, Scott, but I look at these numbers and what's going on in the high plains right now. That 146 in North Dakota, that 173 in Minnesota, that 154 in South Dakota. We had a lot of late planted corn this year, a lot of stuff that's not to maturity level yet, all across the Corn Belt. And
it's easy to forget, those are based on full maturity of late planted corn. And out in those, 5 key western states of Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Nebraska, you don't want to forget that there's, someplace around 9 or 10 million acres of corn that was planted in June out there even. And they're just going to be getting hammered by some really bad weather right now. So and the USDA, with good reason, wouldn't have taken that into account. So that alone tells me that I wouldn't be surprised if that dropped national average yield a bushel or two on corn just from what's going on in the Western Corn Belt this weekend.
And it could. And that freezing temperatures, it looks like it might creep into northern Illinois this weekend as well. There's a possibility when you look at the weather map. So there's a lot left in this corn crop. 168.4 may have surprised a lot of people. I don't think I've met very many people that are looking at a 168 yield, but it is feasible. When we look at their objective yield, basically their ears per acre came down slightly and the implied ear weight went up slightly, which, I don't know, Scott, it is what it is. Right?
Well, I think one of the things that's for some good perspective on all of these discussions about yield is that today's October report in terms of corn crop maturity is more like the September reports we've had in the past. And so, it's still relatively early in the forecasting cycle. At the same time, we preach all the time. They don't want to ignore the USDA information. This is their third shot at the yield, and so you have to give that quite a bit of credibility. But it does seem from the admittedly limited yield reports that I've seen that an increase in that implied ear weight is. I'm just going to be surprised if that's what we see in the end.
I would be too. I mean, most of the yield reports on corn, and this is on the earlier stuff, April, May planted stuff, has been down around 5 to 10% from last year.
Yeah, not in all areas. I think,
areas,
but there are some areas, particularly the western half of Iowa, that the yield reports are very good, and there are other areas. But in general, that's what surprised me is that the direction of the change in the USDA estimate doesn't line up directionally with what I'm hearing from field yield reports.
Yeah,
and admittedly, my sample is very small, so you don't want to. But usually, those things line up better. So it'll be real interesting to see if we learn anything new in November.
It will. It'll be very interesting. Just to give you a little bit of context here, this is the final U.S. corn yield estimate minus the October forecast. Usually they're pretty close. Now, that 2013-14 zero because there was no report that month due to government shutdown. They've missed by 4 bushels one way or the other the last 2 years. And I have a feeling that last year they missed by more than 4 bushels based on the September 1st crop stocks report. So this thing's not over with yet. I would be surprised if they missed 4 bushels too low this year. I'm sort of leaning toward the downside. I don't know about you.
Oh, same. Yeah. Same for me.
So overall, when they lowered harvested acres slightly and raised yield slightly, we've seen U.S. corn production come in at 13.8 billion bushels, quite a bit above the trade guess this year for the October production report. And you got to keep in mind, mainly these misses in corn production tend to be the yield miss, basically, that we saw the last couple of years. There is a chance we could see some more acreage come out of the corn crop, like we discussed earlier. And I believe, and I think you do too, Scott, the November yield forecast, whatever that one is, we're going to be getting close to it. When it comes to November, I think we'll see a lot more corn harvested and maybe have a better idea. So let's just talk about the corn balance sheets in general. This might take us a while. What you're seeing in the first column is USDA's final 2018-19 balance sheets, and we already had the supply set. Feed and residual ended up being quite large due to the surprise in the September 1st stocks report. We saw ethanol fade dramatically over the second half of the marketing year. A lot of ethanol plants have idled or shut down as we've moved through the summer and into October. And we saw exports fall away dramatically starting in about May. The huge South American crops have taken market share from U.S. exports, and we've seen pretty anemic export numbers that have bled into the 1920 marketing year. So we're ended up carrying out about 2.114 billion bushels. USDA supply numbers are in the second column. Supply and demand numbers are in the second column for the October WASDE report. They've got feed and residual about 5.3 billion bushels. Ethanol about 5.4, some seed and industrial use. And exports is the big number, and I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail. They lowered it 150 million bushels. They lowered ethanol 50 million. They lowered exports 150 million due to the anemic start to the marketing year. So that leaves us with about 1.929 carryout, and they're projecting a $3.80 price. What you're seeing in the last 2 columns are my model of yield forecast. I'm not fading their harvested acreage yet, even though I wouldn't be surprised if it went a little bit lower. I'm sort of at a high bound of 166 and a low of 162. If you had to put a gun to my head and ask me what I thought yield would be, I think it's around 163.8 to 164, somewhere in there. But like I said, the USDA's number could be correct. I'm with them on feed and residual. If we have like a 166 yield, I think the residual will be a bit smaller if we fade the yield a little more. I'm with them on the food, seed, and industrial side and ethanol. I think we could see a little bit of strength in the summer next year in ethanol and maybe a little peel back. We've been doing under 1 million barrels a day for the last 3 weeks in ethanol production from EIA reports. I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon. It could be somewhat anemic for a while. But hopefully policy revisions to RFS and other things going on. There's a lot of uncertainty.
There is. I do want to mention that there's a lot more stability in the domestic use of ethanol than is commonly perceived.
Yeah,
there's a lot of discussion out there about small refinery exemptions and physical demand destruction for ethanol. I've been on record for a long time saying I don't see the evidence that that's been happening. That's a piece of good news for the ethanol balance sheet. But it also means that if there is some kind of finalized agreement like what was announced last week, this new package coming out of the White House to boost or to somewhat limit the impact of the SREs. A lot of questions about, well, will that actually increase the ethanol use next year? My opinion is I don't think it'll have any impact on ethanol use whatsoever. And so no upside, but there's a pretty strong floor on ethanol and corn use for ethanol as well.
Yeah, one of the other things I think hurt ethanol in the 18-19 marketing years, we had seen dramatic growth in ethanol exports for 4 straight marketing years, really strong growth. Mm-hmm. And last year it sort of regressed. We were about 75 million gallons below the 17-18 marketing year. I think we could see maybe some recovery in ethanol exports next year, but our big customer, our largest ethanol customer in Brazil, sugar prices are bad. They're probably going to still, use their sugar more for ethanol. They've got a burgeoning corn ethanol industry as well.
So I think that
it's sort of flat.
Yeah, it's pretty much flat. I think the real big risk to ethanol use here on the corn balance sheet is actually a recession.
Yeah.
Because, that will feed directly into gasoline use. We pretty much just use about 10.1% of the gasoline pool in ethanol. So if the gasoline use, overall goes down, which it will in a recession, that could be a source of further weakness. But right now there's some signals that we could be heading into a recession, but it's certainly by no means a sure thing.
Yeah. So let's talk about exports in a little more detail.
Yeah, good idea.
USDA lowered that 150 million bushels to 1.9 billion. I am not, if we're in a high 160s range on yield, I think a little over 2 billion bushels of export seems reasonable. Now, we have got off to a very poor start, and that started in the last marketing year with the huge South American crop and them taking export share. The way their crop seasons got off to a start in South America right now, they've got some delayed planting of their first crops, corn and soybeans in a lot of places. If we push that planting back and it moves the safrinha crop, more into a later planting period, USDA has our Brazilian corn production about 4 billion bushels, basically what
it's
it
the same
did
as last year.
Right? And that's, I just don't think that it could happen. Sure, it could happen, but maybe not. I think a reasonable estimate this early in the marketing year at that yield level is around 2 billion bushels. Fading last year a little bit because we got off to a weak start. Mm-hmm. Through October 3rd, exports are, they're down about 162 million bushels over last year. But we were off to a torrid start last year. USDA, if we went back to October to 2018 and looked at their WASDA report, they said we'd do 2.475 billion bushels of exports. And in that month, they raised it 75 million bushels. We ended up doing 2065. So I think...
largely because of the huge crop in South America.
Yeah, huge crop and very competitive prices in the export market. Brazil's been exporting to some of our traditional customers, Japan, Mexico, Colombia, and they've been basically taking our market share. A shorter crop or a smaller crop in South America, and I expect exports from the U.S. to pick up as we move through the winter months. So we'll see.
So I think it's the way I look at the number today is, we have been on a poor trajectory for corn exports, but the question is, we're a little over a month into the current marketing year.
It's early.
I mean, we've got 10 and a half months to go. What you have to ask yourself is that exactly what, just taking what's happened
the current
since,
trend.
South America had that huge corn crop, the trajectory of exports, is that the only path that you can foresee for exports going forward?
Right.
And that's, I think, it could end up being right, but standing here, it just seems like it's kind of early to throw in the towel on U.S. exports for corn when the long-term average is right there around 2 billion bushels. Has the world changed so much that, we're looking at an 1850 or 1900 number when we've got, at least reasonably adequate supplies. And I think it all really comes down to an expectation of what do you think is going on in South America with the corn crop.
Right,
Are they really going to year after year after year be able to deliver bin busters?
Right.
And we have examples of when that doesn't happen in just very recent years. Why don't you talk about that a little bit, Todd?
Yeah, when we came out of the 16-17 marketing year, Brazil shorted their corn crop a bit, and I think it was like we did over 2.4 billion bushels. It started in the second half of 16-17 and went into the first half of 17-18.
And just why
they had the 2.475 last October as a projection. So those kind of huge export numbers are there to be had. If you just thought Brazil did a normal crop, not a bin buster and not a drought, just a normal crop, them and Argentina just had an average 3.7 in Brazil, 1.85 in Argentina. We should do around 2 billion bushels, in my opinion. And so I don't think that's unreasonable. Now, I know that, the folks at the Outlook Board have to use the information they have available to them at the time. And recently, exports have been anemic. We'll see what happens as we move through the rest of the market.
And I think the lesson is that history says be careful early in the season on export pace, either overreacting to positive news that won't persist. And I think the same thing could be happened with pessimistic news. That's why we're kind of fading what's happened here early on in the marketing year by half.
Man, basically.
Yeah, we're looking for exports in 1920 to go down, just not as much as the USDA is forecasting right now. And that seems to be kind of a conservative, prudent path.
That's just how I forecast it. I mean, they forecast it a different way, and that's fine. Yep. So we got under these different scenarios for yield. I got a little bit of rationing for exports if we come in around 162, and I think that's a fair assumption. So I've got those use numbers about 14.1 billion, or a little lower than 14.1 billion at a 162. So I'm looking at about a 1.6 billion carryout at a 166 yield, which would put us about 11.4% stocks to use, and a cash price a little over $4. Now, if we did around a 162, I think you could see some real strength as we move through the rest of the marketing year. Now, if the yield is 168, right, we are looking in the 385, 380, 390 range cash price for corn, in my opinion.
That's right.
So to give an idea, and we just want to talk a little bit about the upcoming marketing year. I put these basis charts together. This is for Central Illinois, number 2 corn, truck delivery, county elevators. I know some places right now you see corn basis is positive. This is just at a county elevator level. I have the 2018-19 basis there, a 3-year average, and then what we've seen thus far, about a minus 12 in 2019-20 thus far. If the crop goes down, or if we see a poor crop in South America in particular, I think that 18-19 kind of basis pattern makes a lot of sense. But what we normally see in the basis pattern is building out through November, flattening out, right? And then a little bump where we normally see in June for corn prices. I think that could be the case again this year, but it really does come down to what's the yield going to be. If the USDA's yield's right, I think you're going to see a relatively flat basis pattern throughout the marketing year. I don't know what you think, Scott, but
yep.
I think that's where we're at. Whoops, I hit the wrong way. So we had to do this on the fly. So this was at noon. I was looking at the futures market and upset that corn prices were down 14 cents. But this is the basic structure of the forward curve. There's a little bit of carry between December and March. What happened after today is the curve was relatively flat leading into today. And what's happened is it's sort of tipped, and we've got some carry in the market. Now, I don't think we're talking full carry, and I think this crop's a long way from being in the bin. So, yeah, I think you could see it flatten out again depending on what yield does. Go ahead, Scott.
All right. We're going to switch to soybeans now. We'll start again back with the September 1st stocks number that was released back at the end of September. And, the stocks number for at the end of the 2018-19 marketing year, was huge, 913 million bushels, which, by historical standards is a big number. But it turned out that was about 70, 80 million bushels smaller than the giant number everybody was expecting.
Yeah, we had the lower yield a bushel to get.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so while the bullish positive surprise on that quarterly stocks number for soybeans wasn't quite as dramatic as it was for corn, it was still a pretty healthy positive surprise in the range in percentage terms of around 7.5%. So we had to make some adjustments in those old crop numbers because of the lower stock number that came in. We had been for a long time assuming it was going to be north, and at times well north of 1 billion bushels, and it came in fact, at 913 million bushels, which we in soybeans are able to infer because we have all of the use numbers, so we can basically back out what production was, and because the stocks were lower than expected, that told us that we needed to lower acreage and yield for the 2018 soybean crop. In fact, a full bushel on yield.
Yeah.
So that was an adjustment that the market had to go through. So what about 2019? So this shows the 2019 soybean planted area and change from the previous year. And so, we've talked about this before with the really large drop in soybean planted acreage. And in the October production report today, we saw from these numbers a bit of a drop.
Yeah. Like when you look in the Corn Belt, North Dakota's down about 100,000 acres from this actual report in October, and South Dakota's up 100,000. I feel bad for those 100,000 acres today in South Dakota. I don't know about you. And Ohio's up 100,000.
They're cold.
Yeah, there's some cold acres out there. But basically in the Corn Belt and the big soybean states, it's pretty stable.
A little bit of a drift down. And again, here's what we see for planted and harvested acres. Now we've drifted down a little bit. Planted acres of soybeans at 76.457 million acres, harvested now at 75.626 million acres. And again, the same question, when we finally get in particular to January, could these change? I think in soybeans, we have to admit that there's probably even a little bit more uncertainty than in corn because of potential use of soybeans as a cover crop on prevent plant acres. And so all of that is to be shaken out. And then we also have to recognize that the what appears to be a historic blizzard that's going to hit the upper Midwest today and tomorrow might put a further dent in these harvested acres, but very, very hard to predict at this point.
It is.
Soybean yield. The average guess going into the report was 47.3 bushels. The USDA had been at 47.9 in September, and their latest estimate came in at 46.9 bushels an acre, which was below the trend that we're showing here of 48.8. So you can see it's been a while since we've been below trend on soybeans. So 46.9 bushel drop in soybean yields. And interestingly, I don't know what you have to say about this, Todd, but that really lines up with the anecdotal yield reports that I'm hearing that soybean yields continue to disappoint somewhat in most areas.
That is what I've been hearing. Here in Illinois in particular, we did 65 bushels an acre last year, and some places were in the high 80s for their farms, and they've been down substantially from the reports I've heard, and even out of Indiana and some places in Iowa. Yeah, so it's not been that great. It's mediocre at best.
And so the direction of the USDA revision, to me, is at least more consistent with the data that I've been receiving than the 168.4 on corn. Yeah. We'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah. So you can see that trend deviation I just talked about. Right now we're looking at 1.9 bushels below trend based on that latest USDA estimate of the U.S. average yield for soybeans. And you can see we're now getting into the territory of among the larger negative deviations below trend since 1990.
Yeah.
Here's where we're looking at for yields by state. As you can see, in Illinois, we were at 65 last year, 51 this year. So forecasting a strong decline, but yields went down 2 bushels an acre. And you can see that in general, there were declines in all except a few states and a few cases. Found it interesting that Michigan was going up after their awful start to the spring.
I don't know what's going on in Michigan this year.
I don't know. Maybe we can ask Jim Harbaugh.
We'll ask Jim Harbaugh what's going on.
Yeah, we'll ask him.
Get the football and the bean and corn report.
Yeah, he's probably here right now. Maybe we could ask him.
Go talk to him.
My personal expectation, I'll be a little surprised if Illinois yields, for example, in soybeans hold at 50 bushels when we get all said and done. I will not be surprised if we drop another bushel or two.
I could see it going down below 50. Not a long way below 50.
No, I don't either. So, that gives you a clue. I expect a little further erosion in what our U.S. average soybean yield is going to look like. Again, especially you'd have to look at that 35 bushels an acre up in North Dakota, 43 in South Dakota for what they're getting hit with right now, particularly on soybeans, and with the knowledge that there's 14, 15 million acres of soybeans in our 5 key western Corn Belt states that were planted after June 2nd. So we have a huge 15 million acre, essentially double crop soybean planted north of I-80.
Yeah.
I mean, so let's not forget about those acres. So the yield story is not done. We've got to figure out, what's going to happen with all those acres. Again, contrasting with soybeans or corn, this is the soybean objective yield, the grams per pod. So it's pod weight versus pods per 18 square feet. And both of those declined between September and October, which I think was reasonable because if you looked at that implied pod weight was record large in the September report, which just that was one of those really,
yeah,
and it didn't last like I expected. Where are we going now? I think that probably that arrow is going to continue there for 2019 to drift, in the same trajectory. I think it's very hard to predict how much, but I think directionally, I expect this to continue drifting down and to the right. Hard to say how much. So here we go. Here's our recent history of the final U.S. soybean yield estimate minus October. And you can see we can easily have a swing, yet a swing of 1.5 or 2 bushels from this. And in particular, in a year like this with a lot going on, it's even conceivable that it could be as large as plus or minus 3 bushels. I would, again, lean to any revisions in the future being on the downside rather than the upside.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if it was plus 3.
Yeah, I think we can pretty confidently say
we could be getting out our pitchforks and going up to DC.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So here we are at soybean production. The average guess going into the report was 35.83, came out just slightly lower than that, 35.50. And again, you can see the history here of USDA October soybean production minus, I think that should be the final, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
So that's mislabeled.
A typo. Final minus October.
Yeah,
Yep.
so that's final minus October.
It's not October minus October.
Yeah.
Those would all be zero.
We haven't lost our minds yet, have we?
I have, but I think you're doing all right.
Okay, so we still have definitely a scope for the soybean production to easily, go up or down a couple 100 million bushels, and that's what this tells us. So let's talk about the balance sheet. Start with the 18-19. We see that the yield had to be dropped to 50.6 bushels because of the stocks report. We had to make everything fit to that final stocks number of 913 million bushels for 2018-19. And that gets transferred into all of our 2019-20 balance sheets. And so the blue second column is the just released 2019-20 forecast from the USDA in the WSDA offices. And with that drop of yield to 46.9 and shaving a little off of planted and harvest acreage, the crop is forecast at 3.633 billion bushels now, giving us a total supply of 44.83. And the USDA has crush at 21.20, exports at 17.75, seed, feed, and residual at 128 for total consumption of 40.23, and an ending stocks of 460 million bushels, 11.4%, and a season average price of $9. So, Todd, I just got to stop here. Mm-hmm. I think we need to pause and appreciate what an unbelievable turnaround that is in the soybean balance sheet. Just a few months ago, I thought we were looking at 900 to a billion or larger carryouts for the foreseeable future in soybeans. And we're now, with this report, with the adjustments to the last year's ending stocks and a little bit lower production, we're now at 460.
It's amazing what dropping 12 million acres will do to supply.
It's, like I said, the farmer soybean acreage set aside through the prevent plant program worked like a charm.
Like a charm.
Way to go, guys. All right. So where are we at? Like I said, we think that the soybean yield could be a little bit lower than the current USDA's current 46.9. So we're using a range that's pretty close, 46 and 45 bushels an acre. And so we get just a little bit lower acreage or production from around 100 to 200 million bushels less supply than the USDA currently is carrying in their WSDA table. We're going to leave the crush in our scenarios the same. We're going to be, because we're having lower yields and a little bit higher prices, just a little bit more bearish on soybean exports than the USDA, 50 million lower. Again, critical to remember that our scenario for export builds in no chance of a trade agreement. Doing this webinar today, Todd, it's possible that by the 6 o'clock news tonight that could be wrong.
It could be. I don't think so, but it very well could be.
It's possible for something to happen with the negotiations going on in D.C., but we assume nothing's going to happen.
Right.
So we just want to make that completely clear. So in our scenarios where we have 46 bushels an acre, we end up at a carry of 438 million, a stocks-to-use ratio of 11%, and an average farm price of $905. So that scenario's really close to what the USDA. Very similar. We're just kind of tweaking the numbers. And the other scenario is with a almost 2 bushels lower yield, and that gets you down to the bottom line of ending stocks of 362 million bushels, or a stocks-to-use ratio of 9.1%, and a price of season average U.S. price of $9.25. And I know that my mouth is speaking those words, but it feels like an out-of-body experience, Todd, to say 362 and 9.1%. I mean, just go back and compare that to the 2018-19 estimates, where stocks to use were at 23%. And particularly given, the freeze, frost, and storm event going on in the upper Midwest right now, I really don't believe a 45 bushel national average yield on soybeans is out of the question. I mean, it's certainly uncertainty whether we would hit that. We do the numbers, but it's hard for me to believe that we could seriously consider a scenario under 400 million bushels on soybeans, but that looks like that's realistic. Okay, talking about basis in soybeans, not as tight here in central Illinois as for corn. We're pretty much right in there about the 3-year average basis level, which I guess if you look at the 2018-19 pattern, we should feel pretty good about that basis level compared to where we had been. And depending on where that final yield comes out, would we expect a lot more appreciation in the basis? That's an interesting question this year, because if you look at, there's still quite a bit of carry in the futures market, which would suggest that there would be still quite a bit of basis appreciation despite the strength that we've had recently. I think watching this carry in the soybean futures market will be really important as you consider storage strategies with soybeans. Right now, the market's saying, we have plenty of soybeans, store them.
Yeah. But
let's see what happens if we're right as we go another month or two, and if it really does look like we're going down towards a 45 bushel national average yield, then I think we could see this flatten out quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of wild cards. The trade deal, of course, would change everything, right? Even if it was a short one where they agreed to buy agricultural products and we didn't really get any kind of long-run solution. And the South American crop, it's gotten off to a slow start in soybean planting in Brazil and some of the key areas like Mato Grosso and Paraná. So we'll see what happens. Short crop in South America, China might have to come a little bit stronger. They don't need a trade deal to buy soybeans from us. I don't know why everybody keeps saying they do. If they need them, they could come and get them. Right. We'll see what happens. But yeah, there's a lot to be played out in the soybean market.
Okay, we're not done yet. So now we get the Q&A part, and we want to get to your questions. So please submit those. And I'm going to start with an excellent question that was just submitted. How can you explain a potential 550 million swing in soybean ending stocks only equating to a 75 cent per bushel higher farm average price? Excellent question. The way I would answer that, and you can jump in here too, Todd, is that the relationship between price and ending stocks is highly nonlinear. It's a curve. And so you can, when you're sitting out there at 1 billion bushels ending stocks and 24% stocks to use ratio, whichever way you want to measure it, you can reduce stocks a lot and not move price much.
It's flat on the right-hand side.
It's just way flat out to where we were.
You get above
1980s corn.
Right.
And we're just now, with the kind of price stocks to use ratios that we're seeing being
closer to what we
like 9, 10, 11%, is only then do you start getting some serious price action. And so just think of that. That's the key. It's highly nonlinear. It's not a straight line relationship, and it's a really important point to emphasize here because that was an excellent question. So
yeah, I mean, if you thought yields were going to get down in like the 43, 44 range, you're going to start seeing some serious price move.
Yeah, then you could start talking about $10 soybeans.
I don't know about it. Yeah, because you're going to
down 43
you're
or
going to get
44.
stocks back down in the 200 to 300 million bushel range,
right,
where we normally are when we see strong soybean prices. So you get out past 500 million, 450 million bushels, you're on that flat response part.
And so that's why when you reverse it, it takes a long time to get much of a price reaction.
Yep, I agree.
Why don't you take the next one, Todd?
What is the next one?
Whatever you want.
Oh, well, let me look at these questions.
You have a whole menu.
I do. I have a good. Does the larger?
Pick a good one.
I'm going to pick this feed and residual one. Does the larger 2018-19 feed and residual overestimate 2019-20 feed and residual? I don't actually understand what that question is. Do you think that like the 5,300 you see in the 1920 feed and residual is a carryover from the 1819? Yes, I think it's a bit of that in there. Right? Is that what the question is?
I'm not 100% sure on that one.
We're gonna have to fudge on that one. If you could provide some more clarification.
Yeah, whoever asked that, if you could clarify, we'd love to answer that question.
All right, here's one I like. Did you say that you think total consumption is fairly firm where it is, and that any shortfall in production will boost price? So
is that on corn?
I'm just going to do both of them.
Okay.
For soybeans, yes, I think it's relatively firm where it is. There could be some movement there, and a trade deal would change everything.
Right.
So, yes. And for corn, I think it's relatively firm. The real wiggle factor, in my opinion, is the export market, which we talked about in detail.
Right.
I think the ethanol and the industrial is relatively firm at current levels. Feed and residual, we'll see, but there's a lot of hogs on the ground after that hog report we got in September, and I think you could see some strong with diminished ethanol production, so diminished distillers grains and ration. So I think it is the swing factors exports in a lot of ways. So I do think they're relatively firm, and you may disagree, Scott, but I think a much lower yield and lower production is going to be beneficial to prices.
Yeah, if we get that.
Yeah,
and So let's jump to the next one. What to expect from June corn plantings in Illinois and the effect of cold weather this week on the current estimated state yield? From what I'm seeing, I don't think the cold weather is going to have much impact here in Illinois because its duration right now is not expected to be real extensive. Now, things can change. But from what I'm seeing so far, I don't think here in the Eastern Corn Belt that the weather event is going to have much impact. I think the bigger question for the June planted corn in the Eastern Corn Belt is the cool, wet conditions that we've been experiencing now and looks like we're going to continue to experience and bringing the June planted corn to the end of its season. And I think it's going to have struggled to accumulate the growing degree days that are needed at the very end of the season to kind of help top off yields or, continue adding to yield. So I think that's the bigger issue that I see here in Illinois with June planted corn. So your turn next.
Which one? Okay. What would you have expected for the futures soybeans to do today? What about tomorrow? Random walk.
Where did we finish today?
I think we were flat last time.
Yeah, we were flat. We ended up flat.
And I thought they might be up a little bit after that report, in particular with the weather going on in the northern plains. I thought you could see some strength there. I think you might see a little bit tomorrow.
Yeah.
But
so Todd and I've talked about that a little bit. It's very interesting maybe we're just not seeing things correctly, but seems like there's limited excitement about the weather event we keep talking about in the upper Midwest that is ongoing right now. We think it's a pretty big deal. It's not a gigantic impact on the national production situation, but seems to me that that could knock a bushel or two off the national average corn yield and maybe up to a bushel on soybeans. Just from that event alone and the freeze impacts outside of the snow areas and wind, it's just terrible things are happening to farmers up there right now.
Yeah. If you've seen me talk, you know my opinions about North and South Dakota, and I'll just leave it at that. So let me ask this now.
I'm going to apologize to our North Dakota listeners right now for that comment.
Go ahead.
That was it.
Okay.
That's all the further I'll go.
Okay.
All right. Let's try the bottom one. I think that's an interesting question.
Okay. Acre guesses for 2020. For corn, soybean, especially if you have lower ending stocks for 2019. So I think about this quite a bit. And it's really hard to forecast this kind of thing.
I don't think that's the answer that the questioner was asking for.
I'm going to give the answer.
All right.
You can come back on me next year and tell me how wrong I was. So I use my scenarios to think about it. Right?
Okay.
And so I think you could see corn acres just slightly down next year, maybe around 89 million acres.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you could see soybean acres in about the 83 to 84 million acre range. That's what I think.
So basically a big recovery in soybean acres.
Yeah, not like another 90 or an 89.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to imply that.
Yeah, no. That's sort of where I'm trying to predict it now. In a month or two.
Where are all the other prevent plant acres going then?
Don't. You want to get into the prevent plant fight.
You know it had to come up sooner or later.
I'm not talking about it.
All right. I can't bait you into it, huh?
No. Okay. I'm going to take this ASF question.
Yeah, please do.
Can you talk about ASF in Asia and how are you considering the scenario? So that is sort of in the soybean export idea. It's sort of baked in there. We have seen huge losses of hog herd in China, and they're actively trying to rebuild them.
Right.
And they have set up deals, which is unique. They've agreed to import meal from Argentina and Brazil and some canola and other kinds of meal from Russia. So it's like they're setting up a scenario if they can't get the beans, they'll take the meal, right, as they try to rebuild this herd. It looks like a multi-year event to me, and it's spreading. So it's in Vietnam, Mongolia. There's been reports in South Korea. There's been reports in this stuff ASF is pernicious, and it's
hard stuff.
Yeah, it's hard stuff.
And just remind our listeners, ASF is
African swine fever. Sorry, African swine fever, and I hope it never comes over here. And so it's not done. It doesn't feel like it's done running its course, and it does lead to lower soybean demand from China, and we've seen that. And so it sort of helps them in this trade war fight a little bit, as they've just bought millions and millions of tons from Brazil, and now they're coming in a little bit before this trade deal. So I personally think it's a multi-year, and it could be 4 or 5 year kind of event as it tries to rebuild. It really does depend on how, from what I've heard out of China, they're trying to get some of those they've sort of taken some of those smaller operations out, trying to get the industrial ones to, go to virgin territory and rebuild. And I don't know how fast they can rebuild it. My assumption is not as fast as they probably think they can. And so it's going to be there for a while, I think. And so when you look at these kind of export numbers we're talking about in soybeans, that's sort of incorporated in there. How do you correlate? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, it would seem that the light test weight corn hurts feed conversion and ethanol yield. Is this impact significant enough to show up in the consumption numbers? Yes, definitely there is a correlation between test weights and feed conversion and ethanol yield at the individual farm or feeder level or ethanol plant. I've never been able to successfully. It's hard to get that data, and it's hard to know how big that relationship is. So what I'd say, in theory, I agree, but I've never seen compelling evidence that would actually correlate that with feed use and ethanol conversion. But it could be something that gives a little bit of a boost to our feed and corn use next year.
But the discounts you get for light test weight corn is going to take all the...
Right, but it could give a little bit of a lift to the feed and residual use on corn and the ethanol grind number for corn. But I think it's really hard to quantify. Okay.
You may take this one?
Yeah, take the next one.
We got another hog disease one. I think we're just going to... Okay, here we go. If China is buying on price, why does any U.S.-China trade deal make any difference in price? I don't think I said China was buying on price, but I might have. If I did, I misspoke. China is buying, and they've been buying beans from Brazil at a premium to U.S. bean export prices. And they're buying beans from us right now in the lead up to this little trade negotiation. And they've done this since last June. Every time we've come into one of these little trade negotiations and things have started to look like they're thawing a little bit, China takes an opportunity to buy some soybeans, right? And they've done it again. But if the trade deal falls apart, they'll stop. That's the pattern.
Right.
And they'll go back to Brazil. I have this graph I use in presentations where I show Brazil port price versus U.S. port price. And you can plainly see when the trade negotiations are starting to come because they converge and then they'll widen back out, right? And so they aren't necessarily buying on price. I think they're locked into this thing. If they don't get a deal, they're going to try not to buy from us, period. Right? What you've seen in soybean exports since this trade fight started is that dynamic I talked about with trade negotiations. And then in the summer, after the Brazilian crop comes in and they start buying heavily from Brazil, the last couple of years we've seen soybean exports at the end of our marketing year pick up. As we pick up customers, Brazil normally satisfies, right? So you get this little bump at the end of the marketing. It's happened 2 years in a row in July and August as places like Egypt and Pakistan and, EU buy soybeans from us because China's taken all the beans out of Brazil. So I wouldn't say that they're buying on price. They're strategically buying soybeans from the U.S., in my opinion. I don't know.
No, I completely agree with that. We're running out of time, and we've got a few questions left, so I want to get to as many as we can. It says, how do you correlate the average farm price versus the futures price? Well, there's a simple rule that you can use that's it's a rough approximation, but on both corn and soybeans, you can take the December futures price, new crop, or the November new crop soybean price, and that is roughly correlated with the U.S. average cash price, the way the USDA, season average cash price, the way the USDA computes it. You don't have to do anything to it.
Yes.
And so if you want a rule of thumb, just look at the futures price. And so, you could argue, maybe that's part of the reason why the price dropped so much today. Maybe the market had gotten leaning a little too far out on its skis in terms of the season average price. We got up to about $3.95 on new crop futures. Now we're back down to about $3.80, which would be consistent with the USDA's $3.80 season average price. That's a way. So that's a good rule of thumb to use. More precise ways to extract a season average corn and soybean price out of the futures market. I want to recommend a great site at the USDA Economic Research Service, or ERS website, that my good friend Lynn Hoffman has done for years. He has a web spreadsheet tool where you can just fill in the numbers, and he does it for you as the data comes available at any point in the year. And so that spreadsheet's really a handy way if you really want to get technical about extracting season average prices from futures markets.
Basically, what Linwood did is you get a national basis.
Okay, we've
for
got
every month.
1 month left. Have to answer this question.
Okay.
How come harvest acres of corn look flat with last year if there's so much pre-vet plant? Go for it, Todd. You got 1 minute.
No. This is the question, right, that we've all been getting. Like, how can this possibly be?
I'm not dismissing it.
No, I'm not either.
It's an excellent question, and we could honestly have a half-hour webinar on trying to just parse that one out all by itself. And what I was going to say, our story that I think we're sticking with,
I'm sticking with it,
is that what farmers essentially did was kept, as the questioner asked, the planted acreage of corn in the U.S. roughly flat from year to year this year, took
PP.
Yeah, now, gosh, the number's escaping me.
It's 11 million.
Yeah, 11, close to 12 million acres, I think.
Of prevent plant. Which happens to correlate very well with the drop in soybean acres.
Right, of 12 million acres.
Yeah.
So I think that's the basic story, is that farmers took advantage of the flexibility that they have in what is considered their corn base for prevent plant.
Yeah, in their units.
So they have a lot of flexibility that way. And what farmers did is, like I said, they used it was what I called the nature set-aside for soybeans. When I made that comment earlier, farmers said, I'm going to plant as much corn and take as much prevent plant as I can, and I'm going to take all of my prevent plant out of soybeans rather than out of corn.
And that made a lot of sense when you looked at the price ratio as we got into June here in the Eastern Corn Belt.
And if I can put a plug in before we finish, last Thursday and Friday, our friends at the USDA, the team led by the USDA's chief economist, had two really interesting and excellent farmdoc daily articles on trying to exactly answer that question. And I know it's very controversial, and there's a lot of people still really upset about the data and the acreage and what happened out there. But those are two resources that I want to point out to people that I think are really useful. They're thoughtful, real efforts to try to dig into answering that question, and just don't want to see them missed. Well, Todd, we're a couple minutes over.
Yeah.
And I guess it's time to go look for Jim Harbaugh here on the Illinois campus and see what he thinks about the increase in soybean yields in the report today in Michigan. Do you think we can find him?
Yep. Tell him to get ready for a beat down on Saturday.
Well, I'm guessing you're more confident than I am.
Again, gotta be confident.
Before we go too far off the path here, we're going to say thank you for attending and listening in on our webinar today. And I just want to reemphasize that the slides and the video, when we get it all queued up, will be at our new events section of all of our FarmDoc sites. Just go to where it says events, click down, you'll see something that says upcoming and archive of webinars, and just click on the archive and boom, you'll see our beautiful faces there with the webinar. So thank you very much to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you.